started to try to use these drugs, except they were too powerful for that. And so some of them started to have bad trips. What a bad trip was when you took something that you thought was going to make the music great, and suddenly the universe opened up and you were at the edge of the void. You hadn't planned for that. And you got completely disoriented from that, and you started to get frightened and push away, and you had nobody to guide you and no preparation to understand what was happening to you. And you got frightened, and out of that fear came resistance, and out of resistance came closing down, and then panic, and then you were ended up often in a hospital having to be tranquilized. And then coming away saying that's a ghastly thing, and everybody's saying that's terrible. And the people that tranquilized you were people that never had had that chemical. So now the question is, your question is, under what conditions would you take it, and what would be its merit? And I guess I would say that when you're taking a chemical in a society that is made it illegal, first of all, you have to realize that there is an attendant paranoia to the whole phenomenon because of the social structures. Because, as I said, it's set and setting. It's where your mind is at, and it's also the environmental conditions in which you take it. If you can override that, that is, you can create a system out in nature or out in a private space where you can be a setting, meaning surrounded by people who have had good experiences and who are guides or who are well understanding in this, or you yourself are well understanding, then it is possible to use these to benefit. Then the question is, what is it you want from them? That's the set. And if the set is to enhance pleasure, that's what it will do. And then low dosages are fine because they'll allow you to go into the astral planes. If you're going to use these chemicals for profound spiritual transformation, then you're going to use higher dosages. You're going to prepare your body with fasting and with study. And then you're going to do it in the presence of a guide. And you're going to be ready to keep surrendering. What it is really is psychological death. It really has the aspect of lest ye die, ye cannot be born again. It is an experience that is very parallel to psychological death. And we'll talk about this all in the death section we have coming up. That we republished the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a manual called The Psychedelic Experience. Psychedelic is a word which means mind manifesting. It was a term coined by Dr. Humphrey Osmond to describe these experiences. So I would say that in the time that I first started to experiment with these chemicals in 1961, the society that I grew up in and that I had trained myself in, the high priests of that society had become the scientists and had become the intellectuals. And what was valued was what you knew you knew. Do you understand what I'm saying? What you intellectually knew you knew. And science set up the criteria for what you know you know. It's public, it's reproducible, so that all of the techniques of introspection, which had been part of earlier science, were rejected, and things like behaviorism, where you measured things from outside, you treated the human being as an object and measured them from outside in, not from the inner experiences. So that and that defined what reality was, and anything you couldn't measure by scientific criteria was treated as irrelevant. It was treated as something that our tools didn't have anything to say about. So it was an error or irrelevant or unmeasurable. So that the issues of the inner awareness or the soul or any of these things were not usable from science. Science had nothing to say about that. What happened to me was that I met a part of my being that I, as a psychologist, as a professor of human motivation and clinical pathology and so on, I knew nothing about this experience from my intellectual point of view. All my studies hadn't prepared me to understand what this thing was. The person that wrestled with this most closely in the psychological domain was Carl Jung. He really attempted to bridge the gap between the mystical part of ourselves and the psychological, and then Maslow, and there were a number of people after that. And there were a number of philosophers, of course, that were doing this. Going back all the way to Heraclitus and so on. Socrates certainly played with us. Now, when I broke through, what I saw was that the reality that I thought was real was only relatively real. It wasn't absolutely real. What happened to my mind was a shift in consciousness that was very parallel to what Einstein did to Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics treated a certain realm of reality as absolutely real, and Einstein said it all depends on where you're standing. That is real under certain conditions, and in other conditions it isn't real. The reason I bring all that up is because over the years since that early 60s experience, the culture has changed. The worldview has changed. Relative reality is a much more acceptable place of consciousness than it was before. The intellect doesn't quite have the domain, the overriding power that it once had. People are aware of the limits of technology and science much more than they were 20 years ago even. The result is that chemicals are more of an anachronism now. They are less necessary to alterations of consciousness than they once were. I work with teenagers in California, and I'm amazed to find some of these teenagers who have never taken any of these chemicals, never read Eastern philosophy. They've just grown up in rock and roll lyrics, for example. Because if you follow what happened, the way it was transmitted into mainstream society was that the rock and roll musicians started to work with these chemicals. Then their lyrics started to reflect the reality they were seeing. Millions of young people started to learn these lyrics, repeating them over and over again, with emotional intensity from a teenage time when their chemistry is changing. I mean, I'm showing you the overloading of a phenomena. And they, in effect, changed their worldview as a result of that, and experienced the relative reality that the Beatles or the Rolling Stones had done chemically, and they did it non-chemically through just listening to these music. And it got into a vast segment of society. So that in a way, it all happened. It's all over. It's very far out. I mean, it's very hard to perceive this because everybody says, oh, you're kidding, and nothing really changed. And I mean, I can do that trip too, but something did indeed happen, which makes these a little more irrelevant than they used to be, because there are more spaces to play with in the culture than there were before. And in these young people, I suddenly find, like I go to the Middle West in the United States, which is a very conservative area of the country, and I give a lecture which 20 years ago I would have given only to people who had taken psychedelics, because they would be the only ones that would understand what I was talking about. And now I give it to a group, and I bet 70 to 80% of the people in my audience have never taken any chemicals. They haven't read Eastern philosophy, and I'm saying the same thing I was saying 20 years ago, and they're all going like this. Now, and I ask myself, how do they know? How could they possibly know what I'm talking about? And then I realized that it has entered into the culture. And because it's entered into the culture, these are less relevant than they were before. Okay? Now, I will even though there has been a lot of pressure on me because of the misuse of chemicals. In other words, what's happened is, I'm sorry this is so long-winded, but I think this is first chance I've had to really talk about a lot of these things, not just here, but in general, this sophisticatedly. We have in the United States, and it's increasingly happening now in Europe, is the crack phenomenon, in which disempowered segments of society, like inner city blacks and other minority groups, who have very little window of opportunity, where there's high unemployment, where there's very little opportunity for reaping the benefits of an affluent society, through drugs can get immediate gratification, rather than what society does in order to get itself to work is it works upon the basis of delayed gratification. That is, you get educated so later you will be able to have a car and a home and a family. And then you work hard so you can buy insurance so later when you retire you will feel secure. There's always a time-binding component in it in which you pay now, play later, right? As opposed to play now and pay later, which is the crack phenomenon. See? And you take inner city situations now, in New York City, the 11-year-olds who are selling crack are making $500 a day, while their father is making $50 a day at a regular job and in a regular work, and they have gold thises and that's on them, and they are providing instant gratification to people who are basically frustrated in life. The other segment of the society that is using these is the middle class, affluent society. They're using cocaine instead of crack, but that's the milder form of the same thing. What they're using it for is because the myths of the culture promise them that if they got the home, the car, they did it all. They delayed their gratification. If they got all that stuff, they would feel a certain way. But the problem is they don't, because it's externalized stuff. It's not inner stuff. And they were promised, if you have enough money, if you have insurance, if your children are going to the right colleges, if you have this, you will be happy, and they're not. And so there is an increase in alcoholism, there is an increase in all kinds of drug use of people who are frustrated because the fantasy was not a real fantasy. So that's two segments of society that are very vulnerable to the use of drugs as immediate gratification, nothing to do with mysticism. That may happen along the way, but it's almost by error. So what I'm saying to you, there's the context in which we're talking. And I'm saying, yes, these have use, and they still have sacramental, powerful use to taking you beyond your own model. But you've got to realize the conditions in which you're using them in, which has a certain paranoia connected with it, and a certain cultural value and attitude towards what you're doing when you're doing that. The dangers are, one is the bad trip, that you're not prepared so that you'll be frightened. Most of the dangers are psychological. The dangers primarily are not chemical. The only predicament is when you get into chemicals that are, say, opium derivatives, and morphine, crack, things like that, and from coca plants. When you get into these, you're dealing with something that is so profoundly psychologically altering immediately that there is very quick and very powerful addiction to the experience. Because if you have a lousy life, a terrible life, the reentry from this experience of immediate fulfillment and bliss, when you come down, is so horrible that you just want to go back. So there are two places where you bad trip. One is on the way out, when it's more than you expected. The other is when on the way back, when it's too horrible to re-enter into, all right? And those are two places you can get stuck, and they're two different kinds of bad trips. The physiological stuff is much more of a political game than an actuality game. There is probably some short-term evidence that maybe MDMA will have some short-term suppressant effect on serotonin or something like that in the brain, but nothing long-term, no long-term effects that anybody sees as yet. I mean, that's all been political stuff. It's labs that are hired by the government to demonstrate danger. And we just don't have that yet. The psychological danger is that people just won't play the game of society. Kids won't get educated. And it seems to me that if I understand the spiritual sequence, you start out being part of the one with the universe, and then you're socialized into being somebody. And then you've got to get your somebody act together and get grounded and get becoming strongly somebody before you're ready to go into nobody training, which is what mysticism is about. If you try to go into nobody training before you're somebody, you lose your ground. Sorry if this is too much shorthand for some of you, but you lose your ground, and the result is that you're disoriented. And you can't figure out, and a lot of kids seem like that. They take drugs when they're 11, 12, 15, and they get confused because they haven't yet become somebody, if you will. And so they can't get it together. They can't earn a living. They can't get educated. And they're, in a way, they're a problem for society and for themselves. So I'm in favor of discouraging young people from using chemicals until they are well entrenched in their somebodyness. Okay. Am I dealing with the question? Okay. Do you have something to say? I'll tell you, I think that any chemical, I mean, marijuana is a very mild psychedelic. It is not strong enough to override the deeper places in you that might be resisting. It won't take you in a full-blown mystical experience, but it certainly can release a lot of inhibition and open you and make you more sensitive. It can be useful. After a while, I want to show you that who you are is already the Buddha mind, is already Christ consciousness. Who you think you are is not. All right? You're taking a chemical to override who you think you are in order to become who you are. The predicament is that over time you build a model in your mind that who you are is not enough without the chemical. And there is an interesting way in which it ends up undermining your image of yourself. Do you hear that? At the same moment, it does enhance meditation and all that. But it's slowly, I've gotten into that. I mean, I've gotten mildly addicted over years and then got out of it because I saw that it was reinforcing a feeling that I wasn't enough.
What's the feeling that you feel, say, more real when you meditate?
I think it intensifies the immediate experiences around you. It just makes them all more immediate, and it brings you much more. It brings you also much more into the present moment because the amount of time you spend with past and present, future time binding starts to diminish. The predicament is that you get totally preoccupied with the moment and you don't have as much awareness of the context in which the moment exists. So that people that use a lot of marijuana often become less socially conscious of the contextual framework in which they're functioning. They become an immediate intense friendship or an immediate intense experience, but they'll lose time or they'll lose their other social responsibilities. That does happen with that. That's part of the intensification. The question is there any parallel between psychotic experiences and the experiences of LSD? You could look at psychosis as a person flips reality into another reality and then gets stuck in it. In the same way we're stuck in this one. See, we're stuck in one that we all conspire to say is real. All right? So you're always faced with a situation when you're with a psychotic, because from the psychotic's point of view, we're all crazy. All right. Now you say, yeah, but you're paranoid. And then the question is, who's calling who what? You know, I mean, there's always those interesting issues in the profound sense. And we all end up saying reality is what we'll all agree to is reality from our normal waking consciousness. The way in which the chemicals work is that it is certainly possible to go into have a psychotic episode with chemicals. Absolutely. The fact that they loosen the hold of any model, if it works, they loosen the hold of every model. So you're not standing anywhere. You're floating in and out of realities. You're not stuck in any one reality. And then as the chemical wears off, you usually get stuck back in the one you started from. Right? However, people do have psychotic they go into a plane of reality that's unfamiliar to them. They get frightened, and their fear makes them grab, and then they stay in that reality and they don't come back. And that happens in cases, but it's reasonably a small percentage that go psychotic from that. I mean, no more than going to college, I don't think. I mean, it's actually true. Yeah. Is a naturally psychotic experience similar to LSD? It could be, because there is a chemistry in the body that when it works in certain ways, either through chemical imbalance or through some stimulation, can be activated that actually can affect the brain in the same way as an external chemical could do that. And so that there are a lot of people who naturally have mystical experiences and naturally have experiences that move them from one plane of consciousness to another. There are many women at their menstrual period that flip into other planes of consciousness. There are many cases of people in trauma when their car is going over a cliff or something like that flip into other planes of consciousness. So there's plenty of evidence of that there are natural chemicals in the body that will activate. And some people very naturally just go in and out of these a lot. Yeah.
Could you comment then on how you integrate chemicals and the work in the world?
I would say that the chemical experiences have given me a framework, an experiential framework for reperceiving the reality I live in that was so powerful. The validity, the intuitive validity of those experiences was so strong that they have colored the way I have looked at reality ever since that time. And that as I have had, there were a lot of experiences that all of us have all the time that most of us treat as I was out of my mind, or it was irrelevant, or I'm just overtired or something. I'm confused, which suddenly start to make sense to you, so they're not treated as irrelevant anymore because you now have a new context for understanding them. That's one thing that's very clear to me. That's one effect. The next effect that I would say is that at times when I have gotten stuck in the way I see reality, chemicals have given me, have broken my set to allow me to see freshly again. They have over years become less and less relevant and less interesting to me, because I have changed my life more and more to be in harmony with the way in which I know the universe to be through psychedelics. So that if I smoke pot, or if I take MDMA, or if I take acid, it's all kind of interesting, but it's kind of irrelevant. And I don't like the hangover, and I don't like the effects on my body, because it definitely has an effect on your neurophysiological body, because you are if it affects you at all, it's overriding something and giving you energies that you don't have usually available. And in a way, you pay for it later. There is a payment. You can feel a refractory period, a kind of fatigue. There is something where then you have to use more of it the next day to get yourself back into the same space. And that's where addiction comes from generally. So, and I meet people that have smoked grass every day for 20 years, and they get up in the morning and the first thing they do is have a joint. And it's lovely, but they're hooked. I mean, it's not, and the result is that, I had an interesting experience. When I gave lectures for many years, not anymore, but when I gave lectures for many years, I used to smoke a puff of a joint before I give the lecture. Because I was under the impression that when I smoked the joint, my mind opened up and I was more creative and more connected to spirit, and that I owed it to the people that had come to hear me to be as much as I could be for them. I couldn't take acid because I'd lose it too much. I had one great experience when I lost it with acid. This was back in the 60s, and I was speaking at a club in San Francisco, and I took LSD in the afternoon, and the timing was wrong, so that I was peaking or coming to the high point as I came out on the stage. And there were about 300 people out in the audience, and I didn't know what I was doing out on the stage, which was the first problem. And I had been at the ocean all day, and all I saw were these ocean waves. So I said, "Are there any questions?" Which was all I could think of to do. And this fish raised its hand, and this fish had on a vest and a tie and a jacket, and it stood up and it said, it started going blah, 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 and I realized there were words coming out, and I focused, and it was asking me a question. This was back in the 60s, about hypothalamus and serotonin and a lot of stuff. And what I heard was this poor fish saying to me, "Do you love me?" Basically. I mean, I was cutting through all the stuff, you know. So at the end, he sat down, and I said to him, "Yes, I love you." And he stood up and he says, "That doesn't satisfy me at all." And then I knew one of us was in deep trouble. So I was under the impression that that taking psychedelics was affecting my presentations, and so I mean the marijuana, like a puff. And so this friend of mine, this woman, told me very clearly, Judith Stanton. She said, "You know, you're under this impression," but she said, "I think you're absolutely wrong. I think that all that happens is that your judgment about yourself changes, not the actual nature. Your standards get lowered, so that everything you say yes, and it seems like yes. You know, I mean, it all becomes very profound. While it isn't actually any more profound. What you're saying isn't any more profound than if you weren't smoking. It's just that your judgments about it have changed." The dangers of being overwhelmed by bad psychological stuff. It's called bad tripping, yeah. Yeah. Excuse me. I think that if you're going to use powerful psychedelic agents, with mild ones, you will come up to the edge of your deeply repressed material. But usually the mild ones won't force you into it. They'll just force you up to the edge of it, and you'll feel some fear, but you'll push against it. When you use more powerful psychotropic agents, like LSD, you will be forced into those. The mystical place you're looking for is behind those things, going through the unconscious into the superconscious, or into the whatever you want to call that place behind it. Now, the preparations to avoid that are having a guide with whom you are sharing the truth so clearly that when that stuff comes up, you can share that, you can open with that person and go with that. And you can go, if the chemical is powerful enough, it actually takes you right through that so fast you don't have a chance to get neurotic. I mean, this is when it's really powerful. It just goes so fast. If it's less powerful, you can go into the psychologically repressed stuff and get really depressed, frightened. It will imprint. You will have a bad trip. You'll probably have about 10 hours of hell. You'll come back. You'll say, I never want to use that again. And it'll probably take you several months to get over the trauma of having opened to that stuff. That's usually the way it works with those kinds of bad trips. It's not a permanent thing, except in very rare cases where it opens something the person can't deal with and they have a psychotic flip that they don't return from. The probabilities of that are reasonably slight, but that does happen. It does happen. And as I say, the way to avoid that is through preparation, through a guide, through trusting your own intuitive heart as to whether or not you should be doing this or not. When I never say to somebody, you should take this chemical. I will prepare them and tell them, educate them as to what I understand about all of it. And then I say to them, trust your heart. And even if we've made all preparations and they arrive and they've traveled a great distance and they say, I'm feeling a little uncertain, I say, then don't. Because that uncertainty, if you feel you've been pushed into it by social pressure or by expectation and you don't feel right for it, those are real good conditions for having a bad trip. And each person knows what they should avoid. They know what they can handle. I really trust that. I would never decide what another human being should do with their consciousness. I don't feel I have a moral right to do that. I don't have a right to say, you shouldn't take this medicine because you aren't stable enough. I'll say, this is what happens. And if they say to me, do you think I should take the medicine? I may say no or yes. But I generally will not say anything about that. It's up to the individual, because each individual human heart knows what they should do. I really trust that. It is not necessary at all for people. It is not necessary at all for mystical experience. It's not necessary for transformation. Neither is a guru. Neither is meditation. These are all practices. They're all methods, and they're all traps. Every one is a trap. All right? So I could give the same thing for meditation, and you could say, well, I get a feeling you're saying it's necessary. I don't think it's necessary. It's just another method. All right, we've got to go on because we've got a group here with questions, and we're running behind in time. That answers your question, I take it. Next.
I've been smoking pot for 22 years. I've been able to be in the witness position with it. I've seen that for me it has been a very good medicine. It has been part of high openings, and it's helped me in my playfulness and in creativity. Some of my best shamanic journeys. It's been good for me in a lot of ways. I have not felt most of the time a guilt around it. I felt good about it. In the last few years, between a lot of the politicized media hypes about it and just the whole war on drugs coming down, I've begun to feel somewhat confused about whether I am in a state of denial about it or whether I can be the responsible, aware, open human being that I feel I am and be a pot smoker. Can you address that from your enlightened perspective?
Clearly, you and I both see how pot can be a method for opening you to receiving and tuning to planes that are not available to you all the time. But that raises an interesting question of whether or not the use of something to come into some place is reinforcing the fact that you aren't it without it. And it's very interesting to examine who you are without it, as much without getting into a value judgment that it's bad. It's like every method is a trap. It's like meditators get addicted to their meditation. And the game isn't to become a meditator, the game is to be free. And it's free of your method, whatever the method is. So the interesting question is to examine, like if you take, and you may have done that, like you take a 6-month break from it. And then you see where you are, what you're doing, what's about. You got to give it long enough for it to get out of your system and get all the effects. I have noticed in my own life, and that's my chemistry, and it can't be extrapolated to other people necessarily, but I'll share it with you, that if I'm in a situation and I say, if I took a joint, this situation could be more. And I do it, and I experience it being more. First of all, the next day is less. Okay? So that in order to make the next day more, I have to take dope again to make the next day more. That's the first thing I've noticed about myself. So I said, don't extrapolate. I'm just giving you that there is a cost. There's a cost in my wanting more of this moment. I don't get it free in my body chemistry because there's a refractory period, and then I have to smoke more to do it. Now, there are a couple of other things about that moment where I want more. Like, I used to feel that when I smoked, and for years, I would take a puff of a joint before I gave a lecture. Because basically, I felt that people were asking me to connect them with the Spirit, and I felt that what I wasn't enough for what they were asking. But if I took a puff of a joint, I would do something which would make what I offered them more. And in my mind, I was smoking that joint as an offering to them. I used to say, I don't want this stuff. I've got to take it for them. Okay? Judith, who was a very old and dear friend, said to me one day, you know, you're under the illusion that when you smoke, what you say is more profound and more spiritually true than when you don't smoke. She says, I do not find that to be true, and she has listened to me ad nauseum. Okay? And when I analyzed that, I realized that what changed when I smoked was my judgment about what I was saying, not what I was saying. That I was saying the same thing, I was having the same experience, but I was not as harsh on myself about it, so I was feeling different. And that had a cyclical feedback. If I say bloop, and then I don't say, well, that wasn't too good. If I say that wasn't too good, I get tight, and then the next thing I say is a result of that tightness, and then I start a whole sequence of getting tighter and tighter. While if I say bloop, and then I say, gee, that was pretty good, then I open up, and then the next thing is more open and more. So in a way, there are these cycles that spin back, and I do, independent of what Judith says, think that I sometimes am wiser with dope than without it. However, it affected me a lot when she said that, because I began to realize that that was feeding my own sense of inadequacy. My use of dope was feeding my own sense of inadequacy. And I started to say, in effect, to people, look, this is who I am, and this is what I am, and if it's not enough, don't come. Don't come back. This is what I am. Because it's weird when people have paid to be in your presence for you to enunciate wisdom. It's a funny role. I mean, and I know the hype of it, and we all know, but still it's going on. It's happening. And part of my problem with dope was the illegality of it. That I had to have it knowing that I couldn't share the fact that I had it with other people, because I was jeopardizing my own freedom by doing that. So that had a cost. There was a cost in having a method which was illegal. Okay, that's part of it. Not that illegality is appropriate or right, but there was a cost in it. I respect the fact that people can use chemicals sacramentally and use them in a way to open and bring them closer to the Spirit. And I think that you're doing it pretty well, the way I hear you talking about it. You just have to be willing to be very straight with yourself, to examine again and again whether you're copying out. There is no long-term physiological damage that anybody knows about. No, there's no brain damage. I mean, the research is just I've been through it, I've studied it, and some of my most profound friends at Johns Hopkins, at Harvard, and all have studied the data, and there's no stuff about humans and brain damage, okay? Well, what it does is it shifts motivation. Things that you thought were important aren't, and other things are, and it's not clear whether that's so bad, you know? It's not so bad. It gets you out of the kind of a motivational patterns that the culture, that it doesn't make you as adaptable to the cultural motivational scheme. It's not so bad, you know. I'm not sure. It sure does shift motivation, absolutely. What about what? Depression? Well, that's an individual matter, that some people, when they use chemicals, either they go into a depression or what it does, it's interesting that you're talking about depression when you use it or depression afterwards? Maybe what? 5 years after? No, I wouldn't think it is psychogenically linked. I don't think it's psychedelically linked. Oh yeah, sure, you can have a depression afterwards. I mean, the depression can be psychogenic in the sense that you see the beauty of what it's like not to have those inhibitions, and then you get caught back in and you feel lousy. Or it can be purely chemical. It can be that your body used up certain chemicals, and that in the refractory period, when those chemicals are absent, you go into a depression. It can be somatogenic as well as psychogenic. Sure, that can happen. Yeah. I think it's interesting, and you want to trust yourself, be aware of the paranoia in the culture, be aware of the data, be aware of the shifts in the way in which you fit into the world. I mean, I've watched people take drugs and lose interest in most of the things of life and drop out of school and do all those things, and you say, gee whiz, that's a drug casualty. And then I see them 15 years later, and they came out and they went through mental hospitals and all that stuff, and I see them 15 years later, and they're more of a mensch than somebody that went through the whole Harvard curriculum and graduate school and all that stuff. You know, I don't want to advocate it, because I mean, any simplistic thing isn't the right thing, but you really have to see the game as more interesting than the narrow band that the culture defines as appropriate behavior. Yeah. I think I'll tell you something. What's shifted in me was for the first 15 years after 1961, when I first turned on and realized and opened to the spirit, and it was drugs that did it for me. After that, always what I wanted to do was come back into that sweetness. And then there was a point where I wanted to get free more than I wanted to get high. And I became more interested in what brings me down than what gets me out there. And I started to work with my lows, with my depression, with my sadness, with the deadness. And I'd be in a situation, I'd say, this is really boring. And I know if I took a joint, it would open it all up and I'd see the beauty again. And then I'd say, no, this is really boring. And I'd sit with the boring, and as I opened into the boringness, the beauty would be there. And I began to see that I was always afraid of the states when I wasn't turned on, because they weren't enough. And I had to deal in my mind with that thing of more is better, which is a state of mind. And I just wanted to play with it. And I've begun to see that as I stop feeding that more is better and shift to enough is enough, it starts to shift. And I'm not motivated to constantly keep changing my consciousness for it to be enough. I've really been working with enoughness. And it isn't always wonderful, and sometimes it's remarkable, and sometimes without dope, I'm just like blown away by the beauty and the preciousness of it all, too. And so all I'm saying is you just got to examine how you're using it and what it's feeding in your long-term game of your journey into being a free human being. So.